Welcome to this video in which we'll be discussing electrically accessing complex magnetism in rare earth atoms. These are results that are presented in a paper that was published in Nature Communications with the title of Submolecular Modulation of a 4F-driven Kondo resonance by surface-induced asymmetry. And this work was done as a collaboration between scientists at the London Centre for Nanotechnology at University College London and the University of Nottingham in the UK, and at the University of Stuttgart and the Forschungszentrum Jülich in Germany. Now, the topic of this research is magnetism, and magnetism actually occurs from many different elements in the periodic table. Some of the ones that people are most familiar with are actually those in the transition metal series of the periodic table, and these are materials like iron or cobalt, which you can find in regular refrigerator magnets. But it turns out that the most powerful magnets that can be made today are actually made with rare earth elements, and these are in a completely different part of the periodic table. Now, what we are interested in doing is actually studying these magnetic materials one atom at a time, and you need very complex and powerful tools to do this, and one of those tools is a scanning tunneling microscope, so I'd like to describe that for you a little bit before going on to the rest of the work. How does a scanning tunneling microscope work? Well, it turns out that the basics actually involve taking a very sharp metal tip, which you can see illustrated there, and moving it such that it's about 2 or 3 atomic diameters. So that's 1/1000th of a meter or a nanometer above a metal surface. Now, at those very, very small distances, if we apply a voltage between the tip and the metal surface, then even though the two metals are not touching, charges that are in one side can actually undergo a process called quantum mechanical tunneling such that they can go from one side to the other. Now, this process turns out to be exponentially sensitive to the distance, which means that even if you move the tip by about 1/10 of a nanometer, you'll increase the amount of current you get by about a factor of 10. And what that means is that we can actually measure very, very small changes in distance between the tip and the surface, actually down to about 1,000th of a nanometer or a picometer. So once we can measure that current, we actually scan the tip across the surface, and using this we can generate images of our surface and learn more about the electronic properties of the surface as well. So you can actually use the STM to study magnetism from single transition metal atoms. So one of the earliest works in this area was done in 1998, and it was done using cobalt atoms on a gold surface. So the image you see on the left is an STM image of cobalt on gold, and each of these little dots that are circled in orange represents single cobalt atoms on that gold surface. Now, one of the reasons that it was possible to study these cobalt atoms and their magnetism is that the magnetism actually arises from the d shell of these cobalt atoms. So if you remember your chemistry, atoms are filled with charges, and they go in first the s orbitals, then the p orbitals, and then the d orbitals. And the d orbitals turn out to be extended out enough in space that they can actually be accessed electrically with this technique. Now, naturally, people wanted to study the more complex magnetism in the rare earth atoms as well. However, there was a problem with this because the magnetism in these rare earth atoms typically comes from the f orbitals. As you can see in the illustration, the f orbitals are much more complicated, and one of the results of that is that they're actually more spatially confined, which makes it more difficult to access the magnetic properties with a technique like STM. So one of the ways we can do this is we can actually place the magnetic atoms inside of a single molecule, and we can use that to modify their magnetic properties. Now, one of the molecules that's used to do this is a phthalocyanine molecule, and you can see a picture of the chemical structure here. You can see that it's made up of a number of carbon and nitrogen atoms. And it's actually chemically very similar to some other molecules people may be familiar with, such as chlorophyll in plants or heme in blood. Now, you can place a number of transition metal atoms inside these single-decker phthalocyanine molecules, but it turns out that you can also place rare earth atoms in between two phthalocyanine molecules. They form a sort of sandwich, which can be referred to as a double-decker molecule. You can see that on the right, and you can see that there are two phthalocyanine molecules, and then at the center there is your rare earth atom. Now, people have studied these double-decker molecules for many years, and in fact, in 2003, it was discovered that two molecules in particular, terbium double-decker phthalocyanines and dysprosium double-decker phthalocyanines, are excellent single-molecule magnets, which means they display very interesting magnetic properties even with just a single isolated molecule. Moving on, people tried to study these molecules individually using scanning tunneling microscopy, and in fact in 2011 they studied terbium double-decker phthalocyanine molecules on gold surfaces, and they found some very interesting magnetic phenomena. However, this magnetism arose not from the rare earth atom at the center, but actually from the phthalocyanine ligands themselves. More recently, people have looked at neodymium double-decker phthalocyanines on copper surfaces. Now, in these molecules, there isn't any magnetism. However, it is in these systems possible to access the f orbitals, which would be responsible for the magnetism in these systems, directly using scanning tunneling microscopy. So in our work, we actually looked at dysprosium double-decker phthalocyanine molecules, which have also been found to be single-molecule magnets, and we looked at them on a copper surface. On the left, you can see an STM image of our molecules that were imaged at low temperature, and you can see that they have 8 distinct lobes and they form this sort of fourfold symmetric structure. Now, what's interesting is that that symmetry remains at most of the voltages that we take our STM images. However, at some voltages, as you can see on the right, that symmetry doesn't appear. And in fact, if you look at very low positive voltages, the molecules actually look quite asymmetric. This is very interesting, and the fact that it only occurs at certain voltages means that it probably isn't occurring because the molecule is being structurally distorted. This is probably some kind of electronic phenomenon. So we've looked into that in more detail, and what we found is that this actually arises because of what's called Kondo screening between the molecule and the surface. And this is a complicated magnetic interaction between the molecule and the underlying metal. Now, to learn more about how this is possible, and where the origin of this magnetic behavior in the dysprosium double-decker phthalocyanine comes from, we did a number of very complicated state-of-the-art density functional theory calculations to understand this in more detail. And the essence of what we found is that the magnetism does indeed, in this case, come from the dysprosium atom states as opposed to the phthalocyanine ligand. And even more interestingly, although we would normally think that the magnetism comes just from the 4f orbitals, in this particular case, because the dysprosium is sitting inside the double-decker phthalocyanine molecule, the 4f orbitals can actually hybridize with the 3d orbitals and form a new hybrid orbital state. And those orbitals, it turns out, are actually more delocalized than the orbitals by themselves, and that makes it easier to access them electrically. And that's true even if the molecule is isolated and not just sitting on the surface. So in summary, through a combination of experimental observations and theoretical calculations, we've shown a new way to access the complex magnetism in rare earth atoms, and that is by putting them inside these special dysprosium double-decker phthalocyanine molecules. This is very interesting because it allows a rare earth atom to interact magnetically with electrical charge that's passing through the molecule, and that's a crucial step in developing the smallest possible devices based on rare earth elements. Now, details about this can be found in the publication, which appears in Nature Communications. And I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a chance to take a look at the paper in more detail. Thank you very much.